It is known that ancient Egyptian tombs have the curse of the pharaohs. Whoever enters the tomb first will die.
Let the hand raised against my form be withered. Let them be destroyed who attack my name, my foundation, my effigies, the images like unto me. One afternoon on November 26, 1922, archaeologist Howard Carter stood before a sealed doorway at the end of an underground stone tunnel in Egypt's Valley of the Kings. Watching closely was his patron and sponsor, the British nobleman Lord Carnarvon, his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, and a colleague of Carter R. Callender. They were poised to learn whether or not, beyond the door, lay what Carter had been seeking for last 15 years. Most experts, after all, said there were no more important discoveries to be made in the Valley of the Kings. Carter used an iron bar to make a small hole in the door's upper left-hand corner, then enlarged it to the point where he could insert a candle and peer through. At first, he was speechless with amazement, and when the others asked him if he could see anything, it was all he could do to say, "Yes, wonderful things." He had discovered something that many said no longer existed, a virtually intact, the tomb of Tutankhamun, King Tut, pharaoh of Egypt more than 3,000 years earlier. Born during ancient Egypt's 18th dynasty, which stretched from 1550 BC to 1295 BC, Tut began his life under a different name, Tutankhamun. In the years before Tut rose to the throne, Egypt was going through a period of great upheaval. King Amenhotep IV, who is believed to be Tut's father, had turned away from his culture's many gods to worship a sun god called the Aten. In honor of the new deity, he changed his own name to Akhenaten and named his son Tutankhaten, meaning living image of Aten. But around 1336 BC, King Akhenaten died after about 17 years on the throne, and 9-year-old Tut ascended to power. The boy king restored the old ways of the kingdom, bringing back its many gods and opening new temples. Tutankhamun ruled Egypt as pharaoh for 10 largely undistinguished years. He was neither a warrior nor a statesman. He was ruler in name only, the affairs of the kingdom being directed by his great-uncle I, and the army general Hormab, both of whom were eventually to become pharaoh. It was believed that he had been murdered, killed by a blow to the back of the head. A wound had been revealed when his mummy was X-rayed in 1968. Suspicion centered on I, his successor, as the most likely culprit. Whatever the cause, the young pharaoh was dead at an age later estimated at somewhere between 16 and 19. 1899, at the age of 25, Carter was appointed by Sir Gaston Maspero, head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, to be its head inspector in the southern part of the country, which included the Valley of the Kings. While working in this post, he gradually became convinced, against prevailing opinions, that at least one royal tomb had yet to be discovered, that of Tutankhamun. Most archaeologists at the time believed that no more royal mummies were to be found in the Valley of the Kings. A large collection of about 40 such mummies that had been secretly buried by priests thousands of years ago had been found in 1875 by a family that for centuries had made their living robbing tombs. Family members were caught and forced to confess, and authorities recovered the mummies, all neatly labeled by the priests who had buried them. Tutankhamun was not among them. A few years later, 5 more tombs were discovered. They had been robbed of all treasure, but the mummies, none of them Tutankhamun, had been left behind. Then, after a long dry spell, American lawyer and amateur archaeologist Theodore N. Davis found the empty tomb of Hormab and said, "I fear that the Valley of the Kings is now exhausted." Carter was not so sure. In 1907, the French archaeologist Georges Legrain discovered a stele, or pillar, referring to Tutankhamun's coming to the throne. That same year, Davis found, in a mostly empty tomb, some gold leaf stamped with Tutankhamun's name. He also found, in a pit near the entrance to the tomb of Ramses II, remnants of pottery, cups, and jars, one of which bore Tutankhamun's name. In 1907, someone introduced Carter to George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Carnarvon would provide the most essential ingredient for Carter's searches: money. A major exploratory season, or dig, involved the hiring of several hundred workers, and cost what now would be several $100,000. That's how their partnership started. On February 17, 1923, the time came for another momentous opening. As more than 20 people, the cream of Egyptian and British society, looked on, Carter began chipping away at the door behind which he thought was Tutankhamun's final resting place. As before, he made a hole large enough to shine a light through. He later wrote, "It was, beyond any question, the sepulchral chamber in which we stood, for here, towering above us, was one of the great gilt shrines in which kings were laid. Every statue, jar, bead, and scrap of leather were numbered, photographed, and a record kept of where they had been found." One of the most famous spiritualists in Great Britain was an Irishman, William John Warner, who also styled himself Count Louis Le Warner Hammond, or Chero. Among his notable clients who had their palms read and fortunes told were future Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, author Mark Twain, and even the future King Edward VII of Great Britain. Whether or not Carnarvon belongs on the list is not certain, but for some reason, Chero sent the Earl a message in December 1922, about 1 month after the opening of the tomb. He claimed it had been sent to him by the spirit of Meketaten, a daughter of Akhenaten, and warned Carnarvon against removing any objects from the tomb, and that if he did, he would suffer an injury while in the tomb, a sickness from which he would never recover, and that death would claim him in Egypt. Having received the message, Carnarvon reportedly said that he would go ahead with his plans for the tomb no matter what. However, according to the memoirs of his son, shortly to inherit the Carnarvon title, the Earl sent for his own spiritualist, a man known only as Velma. According to writer Barry Wynne, Velma supposedly listened to Carnarvon describe his message from Chero, and then read his palm, noting some ominous spots near his lifeline and seeing great peril for you. Most probably, as the indications of occult interest are so strong in your hand, it will arise from such a source. The shrine was huge, 7 by 11 feet by 9 feet high, filling the entire chamber except for a surrounding space 2 feet wide. Picking their way carefully, Carter, Carnarvon, and Lacau made their way to the eastern end of the shrine where the large folding doors were bolted, but not sealed. Carter says eagerly we drew the bolts, swung back the doors, and there within was a second shrine with similar bolted doors, and upon the bolts a seal, intact. This seal we determined not to break, for our doubts were resolved. Carnarvon knew what this intact seal meant. In a subsequent interview, he said it was, therefore, almost certain that the body of the king was lying somewhere in this second shrine. As far as I know, this had never happened before. We have only found royal personages either hidden away or very much plundered. Carter wrote that there were 2 reasons that he did not want to break the inner seal. The first was that he feared it would cause damage to the second shrine, but the second reason was more personal than practical. A feeling of intrusion had descended heavily upon us with the opening of the doors, heightened, probably, by the almost painful impressiveness of a linen pall, decorated with rosettes, which dropped above the inner shrine. We felt that we were in the presence of the dead king and must do him reverence, and in imagination could see the doors of the successive shrines open one after the other till the innermost disclosed the king himself. At some point during the time the tomb was being closed for the season, Carnarvon was bitten on the cheek by a mosquito. A few days later, while shaving, he was thought to have nicked the bite with his razor. Although he treated the wound immediately with iodine, infection set in, and he began to suffer from swollen glands and a high fever. Less than 2 months after Tutankhamun's burial chamber had been entered, Carnarvon, whose fortune and whose faith in Carter had made the tomb's discovery possible, was dead. With his death was born the story that the tomb was cursed, and that those associated with violating the pharaoh's slumber would share Carnarvon's fate. Newspapers began to spread the story of the curse. Reports the peace of the pharaoh. Another report mentioned a curse carved above the tomb's door. Let the hand raised against my form be withered. Let them be destroyed who attack my name, my foundation, my effigies, the images like unto me. Carnarvon's death took place on April 6th. Carnarvon's son, the 6th Earl, reported that at the moment his mother, Lady Almina, closed his father's eyes, all the lights suddenly went out. We lit candles. I took my father's hand and prayed. Carnarvon's son spoke the following day with the head of the Cairo Electricity Board, who told him that a citywide blackout had been reported to him at I threw on some clothes and had just got into my car when, to my surprise, all the lights in Cairo went on again. The new Earl reported the official as saying, told me they could not find any reason for this failure, and there is no technical explanation for it whatsoever. The dog of the Carnarvon died at the same time as his master back in England. 2 years later, George Benedict, a representative from the Louvre Museum in Paris, died shortly after visiting the tomb. The same year, 1926, saw at least 2 more deaths. Archibald Douglas Reed, an English scientist employed by the Egyptian government, was in charge of taking X-rays of Tutankhamun's mummy before it was removed to the Museum of Cairo. And Mace, one of the first scientists recruited by Carter after the initial discovery of the tomb, died in 1928. He complained of increasing weakness and eventually died in the same Cairo hotel as at Carnarvon. In 1929, Carnarvon's private secretary, Bethel, was also present at the opening of the burial chamber in 1923, found dead in his bedroom, apparently of heart failure. He was only 35 years old. Shortly afterward, Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, committed suicide by jumping from a building. He left a note reading, "I really cannot stand any more horror." But the story was not over yet. As Westbury's body was being transported, the hearse carrying it struck and killed an 80-year-old boy, Joseph Greer. The furor grew when, later the same year, Carnarvon's widow, Almina, died of what might have been an infection from an insect bite, much like her late husband. In January of 1934, Weigall, the Egyptologist reporter who had visited Tutankhamun's tomb, died of an undisclosed illness. Later that month, Lithgow, another veteran of the opening of the burial chamber, fell ill and eventually met his death. In 1939, Carter, Callender, and Burton all died. In 1966, Mohammed Ibrahim, Director General of Egypt's Department of Antiquities, argued against sending some of the artifacts from the tomb to Paris for an exhibition. Shortly after changing his mind, he was killed in an automobile accident. His successor, Gamal Meirez, fared no better in 1972 when a collection of Tutankhamun's treasures were being prepared for shipment to London for an exhibit marking the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the tomb. Asked in an interview with Vandenberg if he thought the curse existed, he answered, "If you add up all these mysterious deaths, you might well think so. But I simply don't believe in it. Look at me. I've been involved with tombs and mummies of the pharaohs all my life. I'm living proof it was all coincidence." 4 weeks later, Meirez died of what was diagnosed as a circulatory collapse at the age of 52. He died on the same day as the golden mask that had covered Tutankhamun's face was packed for shipping. The ancient Egyptians would have had no difficulty at all in stating a firm belief in the curse. Magic was an important and integral part of their lives. There is another scenario about the people who were involved in this process, but they lived their lives, like Losteri, the scientist who actually dissected Tutankhamun's mummy and died 46 years later at the age of 87, or Lucas, who analyzed tissues taken from the mummy and died 27 years later at the age of 79. Carnarvon's daughter Evelyn died in 1980 at the age of 78. Isn't it strange? In 2002, French scientist Sylvain Gandin suggested that Carnarvon's death could have been caused by infection with a highly virulent, very long-lived pathogen such as Bacillus anthracis, the cause of the deadly disease anthrax. Was it a curse, fungus, bacteria, or anthrax? I don't know, but I will end this video with the event that happened in 2006. A team of radiologists was studying the pharaoh's mummy in Cairo when all sorts of difficulties arose. While performing the CT scan, we had several strange occurrences, said Dr. Ashraf Selim of the Qasr Al-Aini Teaching Hospital. The electricity suddenly went out, the CT scanner could not be started, and a team member became ill. If we weren't scientists, we might have become believers in the curse of the pharaohs. The pharaohs were superpowers in the world at their time, but if you want to know about the nexus of Freemasonry and current superpower, United States